don't. And the next session is going to be about network integration and the fun and excitement that happens when you try and slam two networks together. And I'll turn it over to Joe Kovar as our moderator for the panel.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a frog in my throat. I'm going to try not to cough into the microphone. My apologies. This is billed as the network integration panel. And network engineers must be prepared for many situations to keep their operations afloat. One frequently occurring but seldom discussed scenario are the integrations which come with mergers and acquisitions. In addition, resolving technical questions such as protocols, platforms, vendor interop, people face significant organizational challenges, business issues, politics, and the impact from the pursuit of synergies. Lovely word, synergies. This is a proper panel, no slides. It's going to be a conversation between peers who have had a long history in M&A. I'm not going to regurgitate what's in the agenda, but I do want to highlight the fact that the folks who are up here have spent a lot of time with networks as they change companies. Not necessarily with I was reflecting, I've actually only had one job change that was not M&A since 1994. It's kind of bizarre. But McGee here with CenturyLink, and he has ridden out several changes. He's enjoyed the LATA relief and the LEC IBOC integration times. He's well versed in that area. Raz has been working for several ISPs in the 90s. He went and founded a few companies, was a chief scientist for Server Central, and integrated many acquisitions with NLayer and GTT. Dave has been involved with engineering and management in various companies along the way and is currently with Level 3. And Steve also is with Level 3 and came through the Global Crossing integration. And we're just going to start with a little disclaimer. Affiliations are for context and history, and we're all representing our experiences. We won't necessarily be discussing pending or current M&As any of our companies may be doing, but we don't want any lawyers involved. But all the panelists are free to discuss what they see fit. And to kick it off, we're just going to have this conversation that I believe we really need to think. We've had several NANOG sessions that have talked about the technical elements of selecting an IGP and integrating MPLS networks. And so this is actually taking a step back. And I don't know if Dave or Raz, which of you would like to start with talking about the business? We're saying it really comes down to some of the business goals. And go ahead, Dave. Go ahead.
Is this thing on? All right. So, why does a company get acquired? The corporate development people get together and build a business model that's based around this concept of synergies, which is this word that's pretty dirty. Most of us associate it with lots of firings. That would be the cost synergy side, and then there's also revenue synergies or debt synergies in some cases. Basically, it's the principle 1 + 1 = more than 2, and it's the culmination of trying to make that work. But a lot of these models, they aren't perfect when you do an acquisition. Sometimes, depending on the size of the entities, you could have, say, two really large tier 1s that buy each other, and even a tier 1 and a tier 2, and have something called a revenue dis-synergy, where you have customers that are common across both of the companies, and they're buying both companies because they want redundancy. And so they get very concerned about, initially they're concerned about network resiliency, but they could also be concerned about something that's as simple as just economic buying leverage and economic consolidation and supplier management. So this almost right away within the first month after acquisition, one of the first things that you encounter is one of your first barriers, which is commercial challenges to integration, which is customers that don't want you to touch anything just yet. They want to maintain those separate networks for some time, so they have that diversity. So commercial challenges of that nature come out pretty quick.
Rez, you had some thoughts there in terms of the growth effects.
Well, so I think a lot of the thing people don't remember is, there's a lot of reasons to do M&A work besides just you see a company that's a good fit and you think there could be synergies. There's everything from essentially buying revenue. You can make your next quarter look better if you can pick up revenue, and you can really cover a lot of different business aspects by doing that. There's people who have actually been very successful at acquiring and using their acquisition to get more debt leverage so that they can go out and acquire more. If you look historically at Zayo, for example, they've been masters of doing this. There's all of these different reasons, and they're not all around how do we take two tier ones and mash them together, but that's definitely an interesting problem, and that's one where you really have people that they previously bought from two different carriers for a reason, and then that goes away. But it can be anything from buying a bigger network than you. If you look at folks like SBC and AT&T, you can have a situation where an SBC buys AT&T, renames itself AT&T, and turns over the keys to AT&T. So it's not always about who is the buyer or who is the seller.
Sometimes you don't actually wind up with the customers you think you bought. Sometimes the products don't fit, or you have a problem selling the same product even if it isn't the same, or you're seeking to expand a footprint. But what you brought up with AT&T gets back to some of the culture and organizational concerns that sometimes see. And Steve, I think you had some concepts there in terms of the organizational issues that would be worth sharing.
Sure. When I was asked to attend this symposium, I had about 100 hours worth of topics. So, and I actually boiled this down to two main items that I wanted to get across, which was the most important item, in my opinion, for whether a acquisition or merger or union of two acquiescing companies actually will work, is if you get the people lined up correctly and there is no longer them and us, but just us. And in my experience, where mergers and acquisitions have failed is when the them and us was never replaced with us. Because on that day, even if it's not your network and you do not have the expertise for it, you need to treat everyone as your customer, and that doesn't necessarily happen. So that, in my opinion, is the most important item for a successful merger. Everything else, whether it's clash of cultures or disparate technologies, it doesn't matter if you cannot get the people lined up and motivated, understanding in terms of what their job is and where and how the organization should be. Everything else does not matter. The second item that I thought was important to identify is when you have a merger like this, there's going to be some type of complexity. It could be very small. Let's say you're adding unlike a disparate object. Let's say one company doesn't have a video unit. Adding that video unit may be easier. It may be very difficult if you're merging IGPs. But regardless, there is going to be some type of complexity that you can quantify. And someone has to deal with that complexity. And then what's most important is someone at the top, at the strategic level, has to decide which organizations are best capable for handling that complexity and which ones, should do that and how that should be divvied up. So for example, what might make IT or systems job very easy might make engineering's job very difficult. What might make planning's job very easy might make operations job very difficult. But regardless of how you look at it, it's going to be something similar to uncertainty principle, where that is a finite object and you cannot make it go away. So the last item that I thought was important is, how do you deal with that complexity in terms of making the merger happen?
Yeah, who bears the pain was a good line that came out of that conversation.
It would be nice if somebody actually intentionally made a decision about which group would inherit that complexity, but unfortunately that happens more accidentally. There's complexities get swept under the rug oftentimes. There's a decision that one group makes, someone in a vacuum, that can inadvertently impact other groups in ways that wasn't foreseen or even talked about. So I agree that would be important, but I don't know that it happens that much where one group really makes that call. In the organizations that I've been in the past decade plus, we kind of think of the company and the big moving parts as a three-legged stool. You've got engineering as one leg of the stool, the network. As the second, you've got IT, and as the third, you've got product and marketing. And this panel is how not to complete an integration.
Oh, wait, I have a few more things to say about organization.
The inner workings between those three groups are incredibly important. The amount of collaboration that has to occur across those organizations is paramount to making any progress at all. Otherwise, you can easily get into a set of circling interdependencies between the three teams, where the network team thinks that, well, if the product group can figure out how to rationalize the products, then we can do X, Y, and Z in the network. And the product team is thinking, if IT can figure out how to take my rationalized product that I have and build it into the system so that everything works together regardless of the network, then I'll be all set. And the IT organization is thinking, if those network guys can ever make any progress with combining the networks, my job on the IT side would be pretty simple. And the next thing you know, no one's doing anything because they're waiting for someone else to get something done. But in my experience, IT has the most important set of tasks to complete in order to enable the rest of the organization to function and make progress. And if you're struggling at all on the IT side, it's going to thwart all of your plans to make any progress.
Yeah, well, it's, the billing has to happen. You have to have customers get billed. You have to get the money in. The back-end integration, yeah, go. Jump on in, man. I
Just
know
going
you
to
had a
say
thought.
that, kind of continuing on that train of thought, they do have to kind of work in conjunction, though, because if you don't have the same set of products, it's hard to migrate or integrate networks. So, we've had situations where nothing's been decided, and you end up having just continuing with the status quo, and there is no actual integration then.
Kind of ships in the night sort of operation.
Exactly.
Yeah, so one of the, where was I going to go with this? Come back to me.
Okay, well, I thought because the product point had come up when we were having the conversation before, and you had,
I was going to talk about the back end stuff. So I think a lot of people, when you get into M&As, there's some companies that are very good at it. They do this regularly. They have a process. And there's a lot of companies who somehow find their way into it. Either it was a very opportune time where they made a lot of money to sell or buy a company. They bought a distressed asset. But if you don't have this process in place, a lot of times it really goes south very quickly in the integration of the back office. Everything from the contract management to the sales rep integration to all of that, down to the billing. So in my previous life at GTT, when we bought TNet, the data network of IntelliQuint, that was one of our biggest challenges, was just the back end, the monitoring, the polling of the devices. Not so much the polling of the devices, but the linking of that data and the constructs around that. And we spent months doing that. And that was a huge thing that customers want. The very first thing they want when you're talking about doing the integration is how do I buy service from both of you under one contract? How do I mix and match, even if they're two different networks with two different ASNs and different levels of service? How do I go pick up a port from this network in Frankfurt and add it to my contract? And that's something that really you should think about before you ever consider doing M&A work, is how is that going to work out?
Yeah, the databases are a lot more critical sometimes than, arguing over what protocols get used where.
I guess by way of offering some actual maybe advice during this panel, I'm not sure how this works in most networks, but the way our OSS system works is it parses a standard description off the interface. We have standardized interface descriptions. So when the devices are pulled, that's parsed, and then that's used to create the relational information along with the records for that interface stats. And so one of the things we were able to do that was able to provide a moderate level of flexibility was by having all of the information off of the, we actually went with the legacy Global Crossing OSS database and SNMP polling system. We're able to have that go collect information from the legacy level 3 network and collect all that. We were able to actually pick customers up and move them. And because we were collecting that information, it was kind of showing up in the OSS database exactly the way it would have before they were moved. And so from a systems perspective, the systems really had no idea that the customer had been physically picked up and moved, which did something very important for us. It allowed us to delink dependencies in the migration. And every integration is going to have an opportunity for you to create, like I said, a circling set of interdependencies. Anytime that you can find a way to delink things and let one group perform activities that make progress towards integration without impacting other groups, you should find and seek out those opportunities and exploit them.
You didn't have any problem aligning the standards for those interfaces?
We never did. We used the interface standard that was associated with the system stack that customer was a part of. So if you were to actually look at a router, you would find a mix of interface description standards. You'd find legacy level 3 and legacy global crossing interface descriptions on that device.
Cool. Just flexibility being the key to actually making progress.
Mm-hmm.
That there's a host of the back end problems we could spend a lot of time on, but the discussion we had earlier also touched on the wonderful world of ICBs and fun with VPN. I don't know if Steve, if you wanted to talk to any of those points we came across before.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that was interesting that I've observed is that when you migrating is almost not that I'm a coder, but I just remember this from high school programming class. I spend 15% of my time on 95% of the problem, and then the rest of the 85% of the time on all those exceptions. And one of the interesting items is it seems that I see the same thing with migrations, in that it's never the standard products that are ever particularly difficult to migrate. What always seems to be a stumbling block for a generic migration are the network exceptions. So what I've observed is that these network exceptions are more likely to delay or even potentially defeat a migration because they are an exception and they aren't necessarily documented and standardized or in the, I guess we'll call it the company memory. So, and so the larger the company is, the more likely you're going to have those exceptions, just because you're going to have large customers who may be able to leverage their size to enforce, let's say, something that is outside of the standard product. And because of that, if you do have a failure because they're a large customer, they're most likely going to be on your footprint and have a greater opportunity to potentially discourage, future migrations.
You know, like as an example, for the last time we migrated a router from a PE from AS1 over to AS3549, which is where our VPN products live. The first, I don't know, 600 customers on the device took 15 minutes, and the last 5 customers took 3 hours.
Yeah, it's not just with large companies you have to worry about that. Sometimes a small company, if you're buying that, one of the things they've had to do as a small company is bend over to the whims of a significant customer, and they may have, maybe making all the money on some ICPs, maybe only ICPs.
Depending on your company's or your company's product strategy, some companies are designed from the ground up to be a more rigid product that doesn't lend its way to flexibility and whatnot. And that would be important if your marketing strategy was to target more the small to medium-sized business. And if you're targeting larger enterprises, they have more unique needs. And so you have to provide flexibility in terms of capabilities. And you don't want to productize every single one of those. You don't want to make every single one of those commercial. Otherwise, you'll never actually get them out the door. So you end up doing a lot of customs or specials or ICBs or whatever you want to call them. And the trick, I guess, would be to document them better.
Documentation over relying on institutional memory.
But when you're designing an integration plan, even if they were well documented, you might know about them, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to build an engineering plan around all those documented ICBs. You would probably still have to handle them as one-offs.
One of the downsides of when you're buying a distressed asset, which in reality is kind of what's a forcing function for a lot of companies to sell. I mean, you either sell if you want out of the business, you're losing money badly, and you need something to solve your problem, or you're highly successful and you're about to make a lot of money. And a lot of the times, the real motivation is that there's a serious problem. There's people that are leaving, and then as soon as you do the acquisition, that's another big turnover. As soon as there's a bit of a culture clash, you start losing people and you start losing that institutional memory. So when you're doing your research, the very first thing you should look at is how documented is this? How easy is it going to be to integrate? And can we get the people who do know this to document it quickly?
Yeah, the due diligence phase is kind of key.
Well, you're looking at a company. There may be more out there that you're unaware of. So companies have gone through many M&As. There are lots of other small pieces still lurking out there. So I think we still have 50 plus autonomous systems still in use, and they're not all documented. Trying to find the documentation or the right people who have that information is difficult. You're looking for, people who still remain from those legacy companies. So you need to be wary.
Yeah, a nice retention package sometimes is a good thing to cook up. No, go ahead, Steve. Yeah, just don't wait for me. Jump on in.
Sure. I'm too polite. I would, one other comment about all of this is that this is also a moving target. So even if everything's perfectly documented and you've done all your due diligence, because this target moves, you might be surprised by changes that just occurred. And a good example of this is when we began migrating some of the VPN customers from AS1 to AS3549. We had some complex customers who had multiple drain routes for their VPN service. And all of a sudden, their traffic was going overseas, and we were trying to figure it out. And unbeknownst to us, a brand new service special had been added to this customer. So these drain routes existed on the VPN, on the AS3459 VPN product. We had thought we had addressed this, but it did not, and we would have been fine if we had done maybe this migration a month earlier, but because additional implementation had been provisioned for this given customer, what we thought was our target had, moved forward, and we had to adjust after the fact. So that's something else to be aware of, that cycle, can get, even if you think you're on top of everything, that cycle can move so quickly that you will still not capture everything you need for a seamless integration.
And that also ties into what we were talking about before about customer communications actually being a really important element. I think there were some transparency comments that you wanted to expand on.
So I'd say one of the things that I noticed the most in doing all the M&A work that I've done, most customers really don't understand what's happening on the back end. And as transparent as you try to be, you send out notices, you alert them of what's happening, they don't really understand the Herculean efforts that you're going through. You're completely reorganizing the structure of two companies. And you have to accommodate for what were the legacy processes, how do we teach and train and make sure that everyone is up to standards on those. Even things like billing integration, network integration. Ultimately what you're hoping for is to take the two best technologies and come up with something better. And a lot of times what you get is you take the two problem sets and you amplify those. So it's just, the communication should be as thorough and as cohesive as possible, but you're still always going to be against customers who don't really understand what's happening, why it's happening, when it's happening, and you get rumor mills. You get people talking about what is and isn't going to happen on the network integration. But when you're sending out an email, you're sending a very dumbed down, very simplified explanation of the reality, and the more detail you can put behind that, the better.
Managing an integration customer by customer is massively resource intensive, and I can guarantee you that it has never been in a network company's acquisition plan to fund the necessary amount of coordination that's required. What you should have is a dedicated team that manages that. In addition, or outside of your standard grooms team, if you are lucky enough to have a standard grooms team that focuses just on network grooms, have a team that focuses on migrating customers. But what happens is it falls down to salespeople. It falls back to salespeople to have those communications with customers and help to manage those migrations and to plan. But it's not funded. They don't get commission for managing this migration. They don't even get usually the credit for a renewal most of the time. So you don't necessarily have the loyalty of your sales folks on board to help you with this very difficult problem. So that is just kind of an open problem that I would imagine hits every single integration, no matter what's going on.
Yeah, it gets back to organizationally owning and having good leadership at the top, having someone who's in charge of the deals, being able to allocate program managers and actually be able to ensure that the oversight itself is funded.
In my experience, I would say, yeah, it's very much how do you form that cohesive team. So when I flew out here, I flew on United, and I flew on an old Continental plane, and they said, "Thank you very much, your proud Continental crew." And I'm like, how many years has it been since this integration happened? Well,
Yeah.
if you think about the reason that they act this way, these are separate unions, that separate pay scale, separate contracts, separate, so they still see themselves internally as two different organizations. And if you build something like that, when you reorganize people, you've got salespeople who are trying to explain this, but you might very well have just changed their commission plan, and now they're scared and confused, and they're definitely not looking forward to promoting a positive message. So the more that you can work your organization so that people really do integrate, are forced, reorganize teams, force people to integrate, the better off you'll be.
Oh, it's back to the us and them point from Steve. It's getting potentially disparate cultures to combine and get on the same page. Yeah, I don't know, Dave. Your personality is just like overwhelming the mic, man.
I mean, another interesting thing is that the more time that goes on, the more difficult these things become, because different organizations may still have the identities, but new people that come into the company don't even have the history. So when you don't integrate all of your systems and you still have separate products, and customers have a real business need to land in a very specific place on the network in order to make their their network function, that means that the order has to go into the legacy systems associated with that network asset, and therefore that product has to be quoted. And so we've done a lot of work to try and help make this easier by asking questions like, is your customer former legacy level 3 or former legacy global crossing? And imagine a salesperson that came in just 6 months ago getting trained up, and they look at this questionnaire and they have no idea what the history of their customer is, and they scratch their head and go, oh, legacy level 3, I'm pretty sure. And off you go to the races, and then the customer port ends up on the wrong network and you have to reprovision it down the road. So
Before I tip it over to questions, because we kind of went over from the business goals down to the customer themselves, did you want to add anything that we didn't hit yet? Okay, guys.
I'd say something about the network side of the integration. One thing to really keep in mind, especially if you're a large network, multinational network, when you're dealing with customers who are in multiple locations, it is incredibly difficult to do those integrations. So I personally got burned when Level 3 and Global Crossing did a migration where they, without poor maintenance notice, they converted a router from 3549 to 3356 and set local AS, which would have been fine, except that it made all the Level 3 traffic come in through that one port that had been migrated, and that broke a lot of anycast for a lot of customers. You really need to think separately and process what happens when you've got multi-location customers and how are you going to deal with them. And those, sometimes the only way to deal with it really is a customer by customer basis, as opposed to the ones who are single location enterprises who are much easier to deal with.
Yeah, I think what was interesting about that is, talking about the customer by customer, what was ironic as we had our discussion, prior to, this panel, is there actually was a solution to that, but here was a perfect example of where that had not been communicated, as that there was a way to deal with a partial migration, or in this case, a partial AS merge. So the irony was that a tremendous amount of work was done to assist customers in doing an AS merge, but here was a case where that was not communicated, so so that particular tool was not implemented to make that particular integration seamless when it should have been.
we should file a patent on that AS merge thing. It was actually a pretty good piece of engineering work that allowed a port on a customer's network to reside on one of the backbones while all the other ports were on the other network. And despite the fact that there was no geographic alignment across the ports, meaning you could have one port that was just in Miami, and then all the other ports would be spread all over the United States or the US and Europe, and the network would still choose the longer AS path because there was a partial IGP merge that was taking place. It'd still choose the quicker path rather than using the shortest AS path. So that was a good piece of engineering work that helped, should, when it's implemented correctly, help situations like GTT had, or Hurricane. We also did that too, unfortunately, and we try to do a little better planning, but you got to think on your feet sometimes.
Oh yeah, got to be flexible, McGee.
Well, sometimes integration is actually kind of the easy part. Getting everybody on board within the new merged company is another factor. So you have people who are used to working only on, one AS, and they're familiar with that. You start integrating, and they still want to stay in their little silo and don't want to, they've been cross-trained,
They've been cross-trained, but they don't necessarily want to get out of their comfort zone.
Exactly. So, you need to make sure everybody's involved and on board. You've got provisioning people who their workload's been doubled by, all the migrations that need to occur, moving customers from one network to another. You've got integration happening in other areas, merging IGP, and people still want to stay in their little area. So you have to make sure those people who do get cross-trained actually work in the new area
It's
as
kind of
well.
like you got to have a rotation, like the old deck business model of having the staff rotation between dev and operations.
Well, one thing I've noticed about engineers is we're all smart people, but we all like to be smart people. We don't like to admit that we're dumb. And what I noticed was that was the prime motivating factor for people who didn't want to get outside of their comfort zone, was they didn't want to ask a question and look stupid.
It's like, oh no, I actually have to learn something. I've been doing this for 20 years. What do you mean I have to learn something? We're gonna kick it over to, I guess, NANOG 63 for Q&A. If you have any questions, comments, technical, business, or otherwise, like I said, we kind of avoided just the generic argue over IGPs, but if you have a thought, come on up. We got some time for questions. Or we could just keep rambling or phase into the war story part of the program. I see no one at microphones.
We'll let you heckle our bad network integrations. No one? Really?
That means there must be some people missing from this room. Alrighty, guys. Thanks for coming up, and thanks everybody.